So welcome to the OMLC Webinar series. Today we'll be listening to Kaaren Mathias giving us a presentation about realist evaluation and helping us to learn how this can work in a setting where she's worked with outcome mapping as well in the program. And I think we'll have some interesting insights and discussions as well on how does this relate to outcome mapping? What could be some benefits for those of us who want to have an outcome mapping approach? What does realist evaluation maybe add to this? Or yeah, how does it help us? So throughout the call, if you could keep the mute button on as you normally do, but keep some questions coming in the chat function. And we might take some of those questions for clarity in between at some points. But most of the discussion questions we'll keep towards the end. Kaaren will start with some theory at first for those of us who are not so familiar with realist evaluation, and then giving some more practical insight how she's worked with that in India. So just a few words about Kaaren. She, for those of you who don't know her or haven't heard about her, she lives in New Zealand and is a public health doctor, practitioner and researcher based at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. But now, Kaaren, you're in Auckland because you have an outbreak there, is that right? But she can tell you more as she gets on. She has lived and worked in India and is a founder also of the organization Burans. I think she can say how you're meant to pronounce it. And she's worked there with a health and community mental health initiative in northern India, and works with participation, gender, mental health, equity, and health systems in community. So we'll let her get on to her presentation as soon as we can. Yeah, I think I'll just hand it over to you, Kaaren.
Thank you very much, and really nice to be able to join everyone today. So I'm going to be sharing about work that I've been doing in India, and it was a focus that we were doing with young people and building youth resilience. So I'll just get the full screen happening here, and where we go. So realist evaluation is built on realist theory, and particularly critical realism, and it moves a little bit beyond the idea of that what we observe is we can only use a sort of biomedical scientific positivism, which is sort of very much what is real is what you can count kind of ideas. And it takes the idea that the person looking on impacts what happens, and that it's very strongly about relationships. And so sort of taking the idea, it's not there is one view. If you're doing an evaluation, there's not one truth of this is happening and this isn't. It all depends on the stance that you have and where you're standing and how you're looking at things. And so it uses very much the idea, which I think is one that is very strong in outcome mapping, of looking at relationships, and that the place you stand from changes the view that you get. And so that you, rather than saying there's one truth, one way to understand a program or an intervention or any other thing that you're observing, that there are multiple ways to understand it depending on what your view is. And so looking at this next slide, if we're thinking about a lot of programs, and for my work, it's been mostly in global mental health. We know that we will run a program and we know we get certain outcomes or outputs, but there's this black box in the middle, which is around what happens and how do outcomes happen. And so it's essentially, what are the mechanisms to achieve outcomes? And thinking that if we understand how the mechanisms work, we've got a better chance of knowing what it is in the program that's effective, and then we can build on that and use it more widely. So realist evaluation is an approach that tries to use a theory, and it says that the context is really important. And again, this is something that is very strong in outcome mapping, where we recognize that what works in one place won't work somewhere else. And so that there's this very rich, deep context of local factors which impact the implementation of an intervention and may or may not trigger the mechanism, which is what happens between and within people to bring changes in behavior and practices. And we could also say relationships and attitudes. And that leads to outcomes. So the three really strong words in realist evaluation are context, mechanism, and outcomes. And so it really is trying to say all of those three are critical to describe and probe to understand what are the outcomes and what has led to come about. And one thing that often people get confused about is thinking that the intention is the mechanism. So, for example, we might think we ran a training program about hand washing, and the behavior change was that young people started washing their hands. So therefore, the mechanism for change was the hand washing. But actually, I like to think of it as when you push a pen off a table, pushing the pen is the intervention. The pen falls to the ground, but the mechanism by which the pen falls to the ground is actually gravity. So I've facilitated the pen falling to the ground by pushing it off the edge of the table, but the actual mechanism driving that outcome of a pen hitting the ground is gravity. And so it's sort of trying to unpack that and realize that what triggers it in that instance is the hand pushing the pen. And so a lot of evaluation goes ahead where we look at a program, go ahead and evaluate it, but we don't necessarily or recognize the theories behind interventions. But realist evaluation aims to kind of elicit the theories, come up with what's the theory about, why do we think, running programs, hand washing is going to, doing an education session on this is going to change people's behavior. And, in actual fact, the evidence is not very compelling at all that running training programs change hand washing behavior. And so realist evaluation has these middle range theories that try to connect and try to understand how the context, mechanism, and outcomes link up. This is all probably sounding a little abstract, but I'll be right to the program that we've done building on this. So the 4 steps in a typical realist evaluation is formulating a program theory. How do we think this context leads to these outcomes by which mechanism? Then you put it to test, you gather a whole lot of data, you talk to people, is this actually how it works in reality? You go back to your original program theory, refine it, and then, so it's a kind of iterative change model. And then with this new theory, we can develop or change or implement a new program. So the 4 steps that I'll be talking through in the example today. Formulating the program theory is something that you might read. This is what other people who've been doing this work have found effective. You talk to the people who develop an intervention, and it's very much a qualitative data process where you build on what you know, and it's your best guess. It's very much like the hypothesis in a more traditional scientific process. Putting it to test, this is not qualitative or quantitative, it's not always methods to understand both the context, mechanisms, and outcomes. And it's best done with people really close to things on the ground. It doesn't work very well as desktop exercises in a far off land. And so I'm going to now go through how we did a realist evaluation of a peer youth resilience intervention that we were running in India. And so we were wanting to evaluate the outcomes we were looking for. Does it increase social inclusion for young people with health problems? And does it promote well-being or promote mental health? So we had 3 questions, and these are very much the questions that come up every realist evaluation. For whom does this intervention work? Not. How and why does it work? What are the mechanisms? And in what context does it work or not? So we didn't want to assume it works, but we wanted to examine what happens and does it work, and how does it work if it does. So the place we were running this program was in Uttarakhand state. It's a beautiful, quite small state for India. It's got 10 million people, and it's 300 kilometers north of Delhi. It's goes up to the border of Tibet, so quite a hilly area. And the team that I've been leading and working is called Burans. That's our website front page. And we work with the communities in Uttarakhand to promote mental health and well-being by building on their strengths and resources. So the problem that sort of set us going on this was, we know that mental distress, mental ill health is the leading cause of poor health in young people in India. And that when people have difficult lives, like being poor, excluded social identity like gender, and they have a even higher risk of mental ill health. But we also know that when people can build their psychosocial assets, so that something like having skills in planning or positive thinking or emotional regulation, they can have improved outcomes and in terms of mental well-being and impacts things like school attendance, physical health, and many other ways of living. And so we got an intervention called Nidisha. Nidisha means new pathways. And we're particularly looking at building resilience, which is the idea of bouncing back from difficult times. It's like when you fold your ear over and you can twist your ear in all ways and you let go of it, it bounces back to its original shape. And so we were trying to build skills in people in quite adverse circumstances. So some of the kind of things in the intervention was building quite a bit on Martin Seligman's positive psychology, helping young people identify their character strengths, something like their ability to be curious and be a lifelong learner, and then how to expand their use of strength, skills in mental health, communication, negotiation, relationships, skills and shit. Quite a broad intervention which uses modules and meeting in groups. Here's an example of some of the things we talked about. Working with young people living in disadvantaged homes, mostly in slums in June, and we had a workbook which was all translated in Hindi and trying to teach good communication skills. So you can see in this cartoon here, Rita, you don't respect my time when you often arrive late to walk to school. Can you please try to come on time? Skills of saying sorry, skills of communicating well. And so this was our original program theory, where if we describe it narratively, that young people, especially young women, have limited agency, and the health system does provide services to meet the needs of young people with mental health problems. So that's the setting, that it's a very hierarchical and age-based kind of ways that young people typically don't participate in decisions in their own lives when they leave school, who they'll marry, what job they'll do. Often those decisions predominantly taken by parents and relatives, and young people are sometimes not even consulted. So that's the setting. But in this particular case, young women, it's a very patriarchal society that values sons more than daughters. The intervention was the semi-structured, peer-led participated group intervention, which had 18 modules, so meeting 1 week with a group of 12 young people. And it was promoting skills for young people and we were focusing on people who already had poor mental health. And so our hypothesis that these structures activities in a safe social setting would improve their self-confidence, build their interpersonal skills, and then improve their social participation and health. So that was like our initial program theory. And we depicted that here. Just if I can slide the picture. So you can see here we put the context at the bottom. Young women have limited ability to move freely. There's significant exclusion of young people with psychosocial disability. The intervention I've described, we thought that the mechanisms might be that by being part of a group, they'd have a sense of belonging, they'd improve their communication skills, they'd maybe improve their self-management skills, and perhaps have fewer behaviours linked with poor mental health. I hope that this is what would happen, that there'd be improved social inclusion and improved mental health. So that was our initial program theory. If we think of sort of more, I'll just get the thing over here, who are the boundary partners? So this is a group of some of the young women participating in a group activity going for a march, which they were promoting that young women should be allowed to complete high school. So we had 4 main people who were boundary partners. It was the young people participating. There's also adults and parents, because we really needed them on board to allow their daughters particularly to participate. But we also worked with teachers in schools. Some of the programs we ran in schools, and so teachers gave us space and time for that. And many of the young people who, if they needed more formal mental health, we were working with them as well. So those are the boundary partners. So we were making this quantitative outcomes. So there's some things like, what was the attendance? How many young people actually along to the sessions? Like, did it pull them? How did we train the peer facilitators? We actually had a 4-day residential training for the young people who were mostly in their early 20s facility. We measured and counted ways that you might think of as progress markers, things like how many hours of training. And then we also looked at the session and what was the fidelity and how well did they stick to what was on the curriculum. Quite restrictive, so some days they didn't follow it very well at all. And then we also had some outcome measures. So we used 3 psychometric scales. One of them was this one, the participation scale, which is a scale that's been developed to look at how well people participate in this set for South Asia. So something like, do you have equal opportunity as your peers to find work? And then they can say yes, sometimes no. Because we knew that young people are often excluded due to poor mental health. And then we also collected data using quantitative methods. So we did lots of in-depth interviews with the peer facilitators. We did discussions with young people, just with parents. And then we also had lots of just one of the team who were evaluating, and we did lots of watching sessions, taking notes. This photo here is with who's got the blue scarf over her head, is a colleague from University of Melbourne who helping us with this at my first realist evaluation, and she was really helpful. So we had 140 young people participating, mostly young women, but 30 young men. We 11 groups, and they were all from quite disadvantaged communities. It was interesting because we had thought to do it just with young women, and a group of others all got together and said, this isn't fair, all girls get everything, we don't get a chance in life. So we thought, okay, fair enough, they can be included. And they were nearly all they were quite a different group. Nearly all the young men were their main challenge in life was their substance abusing. So they were a lot more so excluded than the young women who mostly had anxiety and type problems. So here's some of the young men who joined. Great guys. They were quite excluded. They weren't allowed to go to the temple. They were all can't go to the temple because they think we're bad people because use substances. We then went about implementing this over finance. We supported the youth facilities by coaching with them and discussing how things went. And we had this really great, in the middle of it was August 12th, that International Youth Day, and we had a big celebration. The young people were really quite enjoyed it and were happy along. We had to do a few things like Muslim young men weren't allowed to walk to and fro without a male relative, but if one of our peer facilitators went on like a walking school bus and picked people up, they could come to meetings. And so here's some of the outcomes. We found that there was some really significant changes in the social exclusion measure. So the blue is what was at the baseline and the orange is afterwards. And you can see that particularly young men moved from 18 down to, I think it was 7 or 8. So a huge drop in their perception of their social exclusion. We used a measure GHQ 12 and, and you can see that again, there's big changes where they had been quite mentally distressed, and that this became a lot lower after participation. And then we also found, these were some of the others we measured, we looked at their gender equal attitudes, their self-efficacy, their self-reported resiliency, what they had learned to do differently. So for example, a whole group of the girls learned a scooter. Some got permission from their parents to travel further out of their own slum areas. They reported being more participatory in their relations with their parents and in decision-making parents. And interesting, the local Sikh Gurudwara decided that all these young men could come back to joining in the temple worship because they were showing that they were making an effort by being part of this group. So they're joining the group, participating regularly in this kind of cut them some slack temple officials. And so when we then were quite we'll need to speed up a little bit, but we're trying to understand what made this happen. And some of the things was, they said, you didn't belittle our talk, but you built it up. We came because we understood what you said. No one cares for drug addicts, that you showed that you did. This was what young men said. We found it really made a difference if the family was supportive or not. And we also found that having a strong relationship with the peer facilitator made a difference. One of the peer facilitators didn't do that so well, and those groups didn't have such good outcomes. Some of the things that were negative context were just the social context. So some of the young women were with a brick. This is the mother saying, how can they do anything? They went up at midnight to go and eat bricks. They return at 11 a.m. and they're so tired they just want to sleep. Who can they speak with? They don't even want to eat, they just want to sleep. And you can imagine when people are working this hard, it's quite hard for them to engage in anything else like this group action. Lots of them reported having new tips, and this was probably the biggest mechanism to bring change. Lots of them hadn't known their neighbours because of restrictions, women to move around. And this is just a great example of young women saying, now we're meeting up and we walked to school together, and we even had a party. We didn't tell our parents. We played and we were all laughing like crazy. And this is quite for young Muslim women who have a very constrained life. A group of them decided they wanted to finish, they'd been pulled out of school by their parents, and then they decided they'd do the online schooling, and they then passed their 10th class. So that was a really good outcome, and it was because of the relationships that were facilitated. The young men going to them, they said, well, before we were called addicts, I attend this group, I'm treated with respect, and they call me a student and ask me when my next class is. And so that was a really important mechanism. It was the perceived change and they received. Inspired to start riding a scooter because of role modeling from participants. And it was also a lot of fun. So saying that just having fun and playing games seemed to also be helpful. So the final program theory is really, it's got a lot of things, and a lot of the context at the bottom didn't change, the intervention didn't change, but the mechanisms are more nuanced and richer. So we've got things like reevaluation of gender attitudes triggered by project staff role modeling. So this was seeing young women driving scooters and thinking, well, I could do that too. We also felt that there were intermediate outcomes, peer friendships, the more positive public perception, the increased freedom movement, which then led to the outcomes we had hoped for, which was increased social inclusion and improved mental health. This diagram looks quite simple, and I spent probably, I'd say it was nearly 2 months in the analysis of data and get to these mechanisms. It was quite a lot of work. It looks a little simple here, but it was a lot of work. We published a couple of our findings in journals. One that was the Realist study in global public health, and then another one in Community Journal of Mental, describing how this works. Trying to sort of pull it together, I think we have done a lot of our program implementation using outcome mapping, and so some of the things that I think quite well was, for example, progress markers map really well onto process evaluation of sort of looking at, how did we implement the action. We collect progress markers in all sorts of different ways, like, how many phone calls did you have to teachers this week as a measure of that, and how many times did the teacher ring you, and how often did you teacher? So those are some of the kinds of progress markers we use, but they were also useful in looking at some of the outcomes of this project. Some of them I haven't noted in the diagram, but for example, a lot of relationships with school teachers, which has meant we could do a whole lot of other work. The outcome stories that are typically used in outcome mapping work very, very well with the qualitative interview process that we were using, because you're wanting to know, how did this come about? What were some of the intermediate steps that led to this outcome? And so I think a good outcome story, to me, it seems possible. I feel there's many other people here much more expert at outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, but I think that work of context, mechanism, and outcome is quite a useful one when you're writing outcome stories, and I think that they map onto each other quite well. I think that one of the other things we found, for example, on this study, I didn't show all the sort of nuanced outcomes, but we found that the outcomes were quite different for young men compared to young women. The forms of social exclusion for girls more about the sort of regime of India, which disadvantages women broadly, whereas for the young men, it was specifically around their substance and alcohol use. And so we got quite different outcomes. And so for the young men, the group participation gave them a social validation that they were our students, whereas for the young men, their mechanisms of social participation was more just that they had the freedom of movement to leave the house and build relationships. So it was quite different mechanisms, and the outcomes, I think, were quite different for young men and women. So I think this question that is a very typical one that you really pose frequently with realist evaluation, who benefits, how and under what circumstances, would be another kind of nuanced one that would be really helpful to ask in outcome mapping, because we know that different relationships and with different boundary partners can have quite different kind of mechanisms and processes. So those were some of the things that I feel where realist evaluation could maybe feed into outcome mapping approaches. But I also think that the probing the mechanisms is something that might be good to start more in outcome mapping. So those are just some thoughts, and this is some of the team here, the Vorans coordination, who I worked with and who helped implement this project, and just, my affiliation to outcome mapping. There's Jeff and me at a meeting back. So so thanks. I hope we can have some time for some discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kaaren, for giving us a brief tour through realist evaluation and and some of the ways that you've worked with realist evaluation in this India experience. So I'm just wondering, Richard, maybe could you share your question? And I'm hoping that other people could think of questions you can ask as well. Either write them up here, or we can give you time as well to tell your question. So Richard, go ahead. It's a bit noisy, Richard says. So I will ask the question, Kaaren, and see if you can help answer. It says, nice presentation and some seemingly important outcomes. I'm curious if you try to assess the likely sustainability of the outcomes or patterns of change. And if so, how did you do this?
So great question. We've recognized that, doing a quantitative measure pre and post has quite sort of limited, because once everyone's very excited. It's like young people coming back from a camp and they're sure that their life is formed and then returns to normal soon. So we have evaluated that. I can share, because when we first ran NIDISHA, the first time we implemented it, we used this pre-post quantitative validated measures, but we then left a group of young women who participated in the first round, and we left it for 9 months, and then we went to measure again. That was the first time we did it, and we found that the improvements in mental well-being and gender equal attitudes were almost good as that they were at the end of the intervention, but some of the youth resilience measures and that at that time had returned nearly to baseline. So mixed, I guess, that it was encouraging. And what we went back and then sort of took young people, and they felt like their home environment was all young women, and they were all young women who dropped out of school in that intervention. They felt like their home set, which did not give them freedom of participation in discussions, where it was, this sort of hegemonic, masculine dominated spaces that they just couldn't have the space. They would school, they just weren't able to practice skills. So they felt that the context they lived in was quite constraining, but they did still have some hopeful outcomes. And then last year we collected the data just before the COVID lockdown all started. Yeah, we actually did a randomized control trial, and so the outcomes in that group actually were maintained. That was 6 months after the year was completed, and they actually got better. So some of the things like the gender equal attitude resilience had improved. And that was because we kept up relationship with the young people, and they were able to they came to play Ludo, team offices. We ran a sports day, and those young people joined in leading the sports day. So I think the ongoing relationship and discussions was quite important for them. It helped maintain. So that group of young people had outcomes 6 months after completion of the intervention. So sorry, a bit of a long answer.
Yeah, well, that sounds good. So maybe that was all worth the effort of the the big randomized control trials to show that as well. Simon, maybe you can ask your question, or Sorry, just before you ask, let's see, Richard, he just wrote, thanks, Kaaren. Fascinating how you've used various approaches at different stages to answer different questions. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Kaaren. It's really interesting to hear you talk about this evaluation approach, because I've heard about it a lot, realist evaluation, and I've read about it, often thought it looks extremely complicated to apply, and I've been told actually there's only a few people in the world that can do it. But I've often thought it looks like it should fit quite naturally with outcome mapping, but I've never heard of a situation where both are used together. But I'd love to hear more. You mentioned on your last slide sort of a few reflections on its use with outcome mapping, and I wondered if there was anything more you could say about how you integrated progress markers into this approach. So you talked about identifying the boundary partners, and then you mentioned that progress markers were already developed as part of the program design, and I wondered if you used and drew on those to build the program theory that you've got in the slide there, and how they relate to those outcome measures that you had another slide with different quantitative outcome measures as well. So did you, how do they relate, and how did you draw on the progress markers?
So we were interested in, so for example, gender equal attitudes and freedom movement. Whole sort of gender regime in India seemed to be really important for both contributing to poor mental health for young women, but also it was potential to some change. So for example, we used progress markers on many of the young women came to group meetings on their own or with a friend, so without our peer facilitators going and picking them up. So they'd walk around the slum and just kind of walk in the school bus, but increasingly young women together with a friend. So we had a program marker of just at each session, how many of you came here by yourselves and how many did we need to pick up? And so quite often at the end, our peer facilitator was walking around and they're like, oh no, she's already gone. Oh, she went by herself. Her friend, Nagma came in. And so it was that wasn't really an outcome, but it was a measure of their independence, both their sort of willingness to be participating or to get off their own bat. And so it was perhaps marking that some of these intermediate outcomes that I've got on the final program theory and peer friendships. So we could come, but it was also a sort of process, just how it came and went to the program. And so we hadn't thought of that as an outcome, but then we thought, well, that is its work. Young women who are moving, who had previously not been able to get to the program by themselves, now and going by themselves, and there's a level of trust. It's kind of hard when Western setting to imagine how constrained the lives of young women, particularly Muslim women in slums are, but a lot of them didn't go next door if they were. A lot of them had been pulled out of school because their parents felt that there was too much risk of character being compromised by coming and going, and they did an adult male to walk them to and from school, so they just stopped them from school. So that's an example of one of the progress markers. Some of the, which also then ended up feeding into the theory. Another one that we looked at was they do active activity. It was for this International Youth Day, and they were running a program for young people in the community to sort of badminton and races and sports. And so for the young men, we looked at how many men were able to get parents' permission, like to use their volleyball nets or their cricket bats. So how much were the parents supporting the activity? So we just how much of the sports equipment that we used borrowed from the community, and how much did we had some funding to go and buy some things. So there was things like that which were sort of mid-engagement that were quite useful to sort of show their participation. Is that roughly? So we were using some counts that you might use for progress markers. Some we had in, to see, love to see, expect to see, but they were also able to feed into the program theory that way.
Great. Kaaren, I have a question just related to this as well. Like when you were doing realist evaluation and trying to find out these mechanisms, where did you start? Did you start from some of these outcomes that you'd seen and that maybe outcome mapping had helped you to look for? Or where did you, or how do you decide that in the realist evaluation?
It probably started with actually, not part of the formal data collection. I was going along and listening in on, I was working with who's one of our other team members, and myself were doing the data collection for the evaluation. But it was things like going along to the fortnightly coach sessions for the peer facilitators. They were, they talked about just some of the sort of practical ways the program was running. It's just so great. We're not having to spend so much time going and picking up all the girls, because they, by themselves, they've made friends with their nearby neighbours, and they're coming together, and their parents now, they've talked about these three girls, and they stick and say, "Hi, Auntie," and then they go off together. And so some of those things, were emerging as the program developed. I think that for me, the most important and useful interviews were from the peer facilitators, because they who had the very strong young people, and were like, "Oh, it's just so great." These two boys who, they were turning up drunk, and we can't hold the meetings in the evening at 6 p.m. because the boys are drunk too much. But they're saying, "Oh, now they've started coming and sitting," and to be honest, the program wasn't a great platform for young men, because the young women were happy to sit in a circle and talk, and the young men would end up having wrestling matches and say, "We're going to go, we're leaving now, we've had enough," and we're like, "Hang on, you're only halfway through." So I think one of the process measures, again, like that, the fact that at the beginning men, only about maybe a third of them would sit the end session at the beginning, because they were just sitting down was just more than they could manage. But by the end, they were enjoying it and having good conversations. And we also found that we'd do about half the session, they would have a game like, wrestling each other's sock off, or playing badminton, or a whole lot of jumping about things. So it was much more kind of kinesthetic, and then they'd sit down again. So anyway, so it was interesting, just as the program developed, talking to peers what's working and what isn't, and what do they think we should do differently. It was not a very rigid intervention. We kept adjusting to fit in with what suited the young people. But then the discussions with young people were also really great, because they were, I guess they were sort of full of how this had been really very positive about it. And so that was also useful. I was going to mention a couple of the unintended outcomes, which I think were positive but were difficult to manage in the community. We had two of the young people eloped, so they found that each other, and they ran away from home and got married. And this really upset the community, because they hadn't been able to arrange the marriage, these two young people, and they then pulled. That was one family, and then they pulled their knee to the young woman got pulled out of the program because they're saying, we're planting seeds of rebellious action. And it was actually nothing to do with us, but it may have been facilitated by a discussion on kind of challenging gender norms, saying that you should be able to choose your own life partner. So there was a couple of things like that, with a bit of fallout from the community, and we actually ended up, that particular group that this young who came from, we ended up having to close that group, and the remaining people joined another one because there was the community house where we held it. They didn't want us to meet there anymore. So that was a little bit challenging, but you can also see it was challenging the gender norms, which may have had some positive as well.
Wow, that's really interesting. I don't know if anyone else listening in on this call has a question. Otherwise, we've got a really good one from Richard. If you could maybe raise your hand in the hand button, or just take a note in the chat if you want to ask the question. I'll read Richard's question in the meantime. Kaaren, you mentioned that realist evaluation can complement outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, as it can unpack why and when outcomes occur. So, for example, under what circumstances. And that would indeed be a great complement to outcome harvesting. In your use of realist evaluation, did under what circumstances include what motivates social actors to change behavior?
Yeah, the under circumstances is a really interesting and important question, and again, we did feel like that made a difference, made us sort of really unpack. So, for example, we had made this assumption that young women weren't able to participate because of the prevailing gender norms, which is the case to a large extent. But there were also young women who had not been able to make friends, and so they didn't like going to school, so they were happy to drop out when their parents said that. So when we understood that there are very limited ways for young women to form friends at school when their parents mistrust them to walk to school, and they don't have friends, and we hadn't even imagined that there would be challenges to have friendships. You imagine in the slum that one's very close contact. So what we was that for many young women, they then made friends, and that this was facilitated the outcomes. But the families that were most constraining, both young, there was also some young Muslim when we ran the program more recently in a different area, and we had a quite sort of open 2 or 3 modules we'd added in around sexual and reproductive orienting, about how bodies develop and names for bodies and just general orientation on sexual and reproductive health. And the young Muslim men abstained, didn't come to sessions, and felt that it was a kind of dirty program and didn't really engage with the rest of the program and didn't have good outcomes at all. And so again, I think understanding the setting and what was part of the intervention that was challenging for them culturally ended up limiting, they didn't end up getting as good benefit and good outcomes from the program because they didn't join, and they judged it negatively because of the program content. So again, I don't know, I'll just go back to looking at your question, Richard, but the under what circumstances, in this case, the social actors who were less likely to gain benefit were those who had from a very fundamentalist Muslim or even Hindu background, which didn't allow them to engage in the kind of ideas of equal participation. So I found that was really useful, and I imagine that being quite useful when looking at outcomes and outcome testing sort of setting, because it allows you to listen on who benefited, who didn't, why not, and then we, trying to talk to young people honestly, like what made the difference. But it wasn't everyone. Like we had, I'll just give one example of a really great at the youth day. Each group was invited to prepare about something that they had learned and thought other young people should. And a group of quite traditional Muslim boys at the youth day in 2019 play about let life do her study. And, it's still got all those kind of plays of I'm going to let my wife study. But this was a young 18-year-old guy standing up saying, I thought that women didn't need to study. I thought that I would tell my wife that they didn't need to, all they have to do is cook and clean. But after this, I can see that I will have a much better relationship, and she will help the children with the homework. And so I'm going to let my wife study. And, there's still a whole lot of patriarchy up in that comment, but it was really, really interesting that there was this huge shift, and it was a whole group, and then we all talked about it, and we all decided that that's what we're going to let our wives do when we get married. And so quite interesting what worked for that group and why not. And that group was led by a young Muslim boy who was quite generous. So I think it was really noticeable that group, whereas the one group led by the Hindu boy amongst didn't work. So it was quite interesting to probe those sort of mechanisms as well.
Yeah, that sounds like very useful information to have as you're thinking about how to adapt your work going forward. Like, what are the things that really triggered and for who and what circumstances? Must be very useful. Not just to get another program theory, but just trying to get insight to new strategies and new activities and ways of working. Practically. So time is ticking and we've only got a few more minutes. Thank you so much, Kaaren, for all of your insights and for sharing what you have experienced. Simon, I'm wondering if you could just help share during the last few minutes a little bit about the upcoming events in the outcome mapping learning community.
Sure.
And I'm sure, actually, just before I hand over to you, Kaaren, you're around on the outcome mapping learning community. If there's more questions, as any of us try to figure out whether we can use realist evaluation, I'm sure you might have some questions coming your way. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks, Kaaren, and thanks, Marianne, for hosting today. Just a quick message before you all leave. We've got our next webinar next month, November 24th. This time it's at a slightly different time. It'll be 8:30 a.m. East Coast in the US, or 1:30 Universal Time. And the topic is on gender inequity transformative outcome mapping. So I feel like we've had a bit of a taster with Karen's work in India today, hearing about some of the work around gender norms. This next webinar will look at a bit more systematically how outcome mapping can be oriented towards supporting gender inequity transformative change. So we look forward to seeing you there. And lastly is, if you haven't heard, we have an online workshop coming up starting next month. It'll run for 6 sessions and you can register on our website. This is a paid workshop. It's not part of our free webinar series. So have a look on the website for more details about that. Thank you again to Kaaren and Marianne, and thank you all for joining today.